home in search of a better life. Today, he'll be continuing with their life once they arrive in America. But Dale has a confession. He's only half Swede. But his dad filled him with an ample amount of Swedish pride. And early in his life, his dad told him of his great-great-grandfather who immigrated from Mora, Sweden, to Brunswick, Minnesota, near Mora, Minnesota. And from that, Dale has been interested in his Swedish roots. He has uncovered many more immigration stories, of which he will share one today. Dale?
Thank you. And I forgot to write on there, the Israelson was the fellow that immigrated from Mora, Sweden to Brunswick, and he's credited with naming Mora, Minnesota, so that's claim to fame. When we last talked in November, we brought the Swedes from Venjan, Sweden. There were 63 people. They were all related in some way or another from Venjan. And first of all, I'd like to ask you to put your mind in a place where there are none of what we would think of today as a normal, everyday things. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There's no phones. There's no cars. You don't have a flush toilet. It's as primitive as you can get. And where you've settled, you've just come from a place with family and friends, your church, whatever, and all you have is wilderness and woods. The folks from Sweden, 63 of them, left Venjan, which is in Dalarna province, on May 12th, 1869. So they were going to leave behind the family, and they were likely never to see these people again. They loaded up their wagons with all the possessions that they thought that they would need in their new land. They had homemade boxes filled with bedding, copper kettles, homespun clothes, axes, knives, and other things that they thought would be necessities. The wagons were so fully loaded that only those that were too young to walk were able to ride on the wagons. The rest walked behind the wagons for about 175 miles to a town called Arvika. There they sold the wagons and horses and boarded a train for Oslo. From Oslo, they got on a freighter to cross a very rough North Sea to Leith in Scotland. There was seasickness, all kinds of other fun things aboard a ship that was way too full of a lot of people. From Leith, they took a train to Glasgow, where they boarded a ship to get to New York. From there, they rode a train to Chicago, and then on another train to La Crosse, where they had to take a riverboat to St. Paul. When they got to St. Paul, they continued on to Carver County, where they must have known some other Swedish immigrants so they could stay with them. And this was about a 60-mile trip from Carver County, and I'm guessing there was a lot of walking involved in that also. One of the 63 immigrants was a young boy by the name of Ole Olsen, and he was born in 1863. So at the time of this crossing, he was 6 years old. When he was 75 years old, he wrote down events of their trip and of the first few years in their new land. And I couldn't paraphrase it any better than what he has to say in a book that he wrote. And I certainly couldn't do it justice. So what I'm going to be doing is reading from his account. And just give me 1 minute to pull this up. Well, I'm going to continue on here, and this isn't going to be exactly what I had planned because I have about every other page written down. There's no internet here that I can pick up, and for whatever reason, my text vanished, and so I've got every other page. I'll try to paraphrase what's in the page that's missing. At any rate, we now left St. Paul, these are Ole's words, for Carver County, a distance of 60 miles. We arrived there on June 24th, a big Swedish holiday, midsummer day, after a journey of 43 days. Here the mother stayed with the children while the men set out to seek homestead land. They were anxious to get homes of their own, so on the very day we reached Carver, the 10 men in our company set out on foot for Alexandria, a distance of about 100 miles, to the land office. And again, this is on foot. Upon reaching there, they were told that there was no homestead land to get. They then walked still further from their families as they had been advised to go to Ottertail County. But when they reached there, they were told that they would have to wait until spring when the surveying should be completed. They did not feel that they could wait that long and return to their families in Carver. So after the first 100 miles, they had to walk 50 more miles to get to Ottertail County, and now walk that 150 miles back to Carver County. Several of the families decided to move to Minneapolis, where they worked for a year or two, but Father, Uncle Andrew, and Siegfried Anderson and his father were persistent in their determination to locate on a homestead if it were possible to obtain one. These four went to a land office at Taylor's Falls and were told there was some homestead land to be had at Stanchfield Brook. At this time, Dalbo, Maple Ridge, and Stanchfield townships were one. And so this is right around the Cambridge area. The whole tract was known by the name of Stanchfield Brook. They were directed to now what is Section 18, Maple Ridge Township, where homesteads were last obtained. And they then walked with lighter hearts back to Taylor's Falls, a distance of 55 miles, where the necessary papers were signed. They returned to their newly acquired land to cut hay for the stock, which they planned to purchase in Carver County. They also blazed a trail for 6 miles. The Looney family had settled on Section 10 the same year, so the trees and brush had been cut that far. Their families were overjoyed to see them upon their return to Carver, and they were eager to see their new homes in the wilderness. Father and Uncle Andrew each bought a steer and a cow, and the Anderson family bought a yoke of oxen and a cow. The families also bought 2 wagons and yoked their oxen to the wagons, and for the last time loaded their odd-looking baggage, which they had brought from the homeland, onto their wagons and started out on the last lap of their wearisome journey. They had no canvas over their wagons to protect themselves and their goods from the rain and the sun. When they were about 45 miles from their new land near Anoka, there was a big rainstorm that came, a cold rain, and one of the ladies was pregnant, and she had to have her baby under a wagon in a rainstorm. So this
Approximately what years are you speaking?
this is 1869. 1869 they left. This would be probably July or August. They arrived in Carver on June 24th. They left Venjan on May 12th. So it took them 43 days to get to Carver, and now once they've got to a new homeland with trees and so forth, now they've got to build shelter because the winter is coming pretty soon too. So at any rate, this fellow lived until age 52, and Ole said that he lived to a ripe old age as a strong man considering how he was born. So upon arrival in where they were and did some cutting, the first thing they did was set up kind of a brush lean-to to keep them out of the weather right away. So they had built 2 little lean-to shacks with birch bark covering for a roof, and a little hole in the middle for a chimney of sorts for when they built a fire to keep warm. And after that, they built a 16 by 18 foot log cabin. And here, 4 families lived the first winter, 19 people in a 16 foot by 18 foot log cabin. And I'm sure that there was no real cooking facilities in there or whatever. The beds were bunks that were hung out from the walls, and the little kids had beds underneath them. Ole then went on to talk about the beds, and they were made out of corn husks. So their bedding, and they said it was not like the mattresses they had back in Sweden. There were no mattresses like that to be had here in America, and he said that after rolling around a couple of times in the middle of the night, the corn husks would kind of move away, and then you were on the hard ground. In the spring, then they got together, and each of the 4 families built a new log cabin for themselves, and everybody helped out. It was all a united process where they all got together to help build the cabins for each other. And here he talks about how hard it was for the ladies, and there were times where they missed home, they missed the comforts of home, they missed their families and so forth, and he talked about the mothers. They wept together and they consoled each other and tried to make the best of what they could in the new land. He talked about the Indians, and they lived next door to a family called the Xinhua family, and they thought they all had different language, of course. They spoke Swedish, and the Chippewa Indians spoke, obviously, Anishinaabe, and so they couldn't speak with each other. But the Indians would come and bring a blanket, and then they would put the blanket over their head so that to keep the light out, and they would peer into the windows and watch what was going on. And so it kind of these people didn't seem to be upset by it, although if again you take this into context, it was within 10 years of that the Sioux uprising happened in Mankato. And so I'm sure that in Sweden they had heard about this, and it must have given them a little bit of pause. But at any rate, the families were on friendly terms with the natives, and he tells more stories about them. And he says, I now wonder how our parents dared leave a child at home alone, even for a short time. At one time, when I was left alone, a very old Indian came to buy potatoes. I could not understand his language any better than he understood mine, but he made himself understood by gathering a few stones the size of potatoes and burying them in the ground. He then motioned to our potato patch and dug up the stones he had planted. We walked out to the potato patch, and I dug enough potatoes for a few meals. While he helped me pick them, he admired me for my bravery and patted me as he spoke words of praise. This I understood by his actions rather than his words. I received a large piece of venison for my potatoes. He talked about the Indians and that one time the Indian lady invited, the Indian mother invited he and his siblings over for soup. And I don't think it was a very tasty soup. They weren't excited about it, but the Indian families, the Xinhua's dog came and got into the soup pot before it was able to be dished out and eaten. And it didn't bother the Indian lady, but the kids were a little bit taken aback by it, and they took off and ran home, and they felt more at home eating their mother's cornmeal mush. He talked about the Indians and their burial practices, and over by Stanchfield Lake, there was a funeral procession, and they brought the corpse over to the burial grounds, and they built a doghouse type structure above it, and there they put maple sugar and tobacco in there. And then they felt that if they came back and the items that they left were still there, the spirit had gone away to the happy hunting grounds. If it was gone, then the ghost had come back and the spirit hadn't left. They said in reality the squirrels ate the maple sugar, and no one but man would eat the tobacco or use the tobacco. So they talked about one time they were going to pick some cranberries, and they got there, and there was a group of about 25 Indians, and they prevented them from picking the cranberries. But the Indians had a baby that was probably not big enough to crawl, and it must have been some kind of a early ritual. They said that they stripped the baby of the clothes and dipped him in the water, but it was so cold, he said there was white frost on the ground, and the baby squealed, and all of the Indians laughed hilariously. And he said, that must be the part of where it's the survival of the fittest. The Xinhua family came to visit them quite often, and it sounds like it was an open door policy. They just came and sat down with them. And so they'd sit there for a while, and he said when his mother got tired of them, she would boil a barley concoction that they used instead of coffee. And the smell bothered the Indians, and so then at that point they would leave. So when she was tired of her neighbors being there, she just boiled up some of that barley concoction, and then they left. One of the in the first years that they were there, the cash crops that they used, that they sold to get was ginseng, and evidently ginseng they could sell down in Minneapolis, and they made money until they had cleared enough land to start raising some cash crops. And they would leave and walk around, and they would scour the woods near and far, sometimes walking 7 miles from home in search of ginseng. Occasionally, we took provisions with us and were gone for 3 days at a time, camping out in the open where the wolves howled and the night owls hooted mournfully through the night. Now young people cannot sleep unless they have spring coil mattresses, but we slept soundly on the ground with the roots of trees coiled under us. Upon occasion, a bear, which had been attracted by our bonfire, came up to our camp at night. We were not afraid, as we always carried guns. These expeditions were made in the fall when it was cold, and we kept our bonfires burning all night. We were sometimes awakened by the cold on damp, frosty nights when our fire got low, but someone would put on more fuel, and it would soon be blazing, and we would go back to sleep. None of us was troubled with insomnia. In this way, we made our living for the first few years until we had cleared some of the heavily wooded land, which was done by cutting and burning the trees and brush. We then started farming and enlarging our farms by clearing about an acre a year. We did not care to live much like our uncivilized neighbor, the Indian, but we had the urge to bring civilization to the wilderness. In the year 1871, a school district was organized, and one of the 2 rooms of my father's log cabin was set apart for a schoolroom. My father was elected clerk with my Uncle Andrew director. Mary Edblad was employed as our teacher. Her school term was 2.5 months in the spring and 2.5 months in the fall. The salary was $20 per month, and out of this she must board herself. The school got some aid from the federal tax. Mary had a portable organ, which she brought with her and taught the children hymns along with their lessons. I used to envy the children who had a distance to school, as I had no chance to do any mischief on the way to and from school. Since school was held right in my home, I was always under my parents' observing eyes, as well as at my mother's beck and call. She would call me at recess to go out for wood or water. We had an open well, and the water was brought up by the bucket attached to a rope which was worked by a pulley. I had no schooling in Sweden, as I was not of school age, but I remember accompanying my sister Carrie to school one day, and that I did not like their severe method of punishing children for any little disobedience. I also remember the privilege of accompanying my parents and sisters to church on an early Christmas morning. It still being very dark, each person carried a torch made out of dry pine with plenty of pitch smeared on, which burned brightly. Torches could be seen in all directions for quite a distance as the folks came toward the church. Some of the people came on skis, while others rode in sleighs drawn by horses. As each one reached the church, he stuck his light in the snow to burn as long as it lasted. This was an impressive sight in those non-electric days. Inside the church was a high arch of candles, which I thought very beautiful and wonderful. There was very little beauty or enjoyment. Therefore, we enjoyed anything which was a little out of the ordinary. The church had no heating plant, so although we wore home-knit stockings, home-woven clothing, and sheepskin jackets, they were still quite cold. He talks about in the early days when they would go to Cambridge, they had no newspaper. There was no way of communication, but when they got to Cambridge, there was an open well. There was no water system or anything like that, but there was a community well, and that's where people gathered. They had troughs for horses and so forth, and that's where people picked up gossip and so forth. And so that was their community gathering space. He talks about the nearest post office being 14 miles away. Of course, you had to hike to the post office to get the mail. He remembered one time he had a hike to the post office to deliver a mail back to their relatives in Sweden. And so he and his brother hiked the 14 miles, except that it had been raining a lot and their bridge washed out. So when they got to the river, and this is probably the river that you go across by Pine City, the Snake River. This is probably that. So they took off all their clothes and wrapped the letter in the clothes and put it atop one of their heads and swam across the river and then dried off and continued on to mail the letter. Lots and lots of stories such as that. Oops, excuse me. They talked about when they had grain, when they started to grow crops. It was a laborious proposition, and everybody got together to thresh the grain. He told about the process for that, and the kids had to bind up the sheaves, and you'd tie that with other pieces of grain to tie that up. And over the years, then how it mechanized, and they had oxen that they would come and they fashioned a big wheel with cogs, and the oxen, they had 2 oxen set up to pull it around, except that the oxen, as they went around in the circle, would get dizzy and fall, and then invariably break a cog. And so they had plenty of cogs set so that it didn't take them very long to replace a cog and get things moving again. He talks about the hardships. He talks about the church and going to confirmation, and they had to go to Cambridge for confirmation, and everybody had to go to 2 years of confirmation. And when they had the classes, then they would hike, and it was 15 miles to Cambridge, and then spend the night with somebody, and usually they stayed in somebody's hay-loft and slept in the hay. They said that it did not bother them. They were used to it. They always had good hospitality, and they always enjoyed the company of other people. It was a much simpler time. He talked about hunting. He said he had shot 30 deer in his lifetime. He got into trying to snare deer, and he had gotten at least one by the snare method. And then one time, his uncle made a comment that one of his steers was missing, at which point Ole got a little nervous, went and checked his trap line and found out that the steer was caught, and his horns were caught in the trap line. He said it was a little bit interesting getting the steer freed up, but he didn't do any more trapping after that. He didn't get in trouble for that one, but at any rate, this is maybe too long for anybody for what we had anyway. I apologize for appearing to be unprepared. I hope these stories have been good. There's a little bit, a couple of things that I would like to mention. I calculated the distance that these men had to walk from the beginning of when they left Venjan, Sweden, to just to the point of where they had their homesteads registered. And they had over 800 miles walking that summer. And my neighbor, when he comes to visit me, it's not even a quarter mile, and he's always got to be on his wheeler. He never hikes over to visit me. Always on his wheeler, but 800 miles, and we think we've got it rough. One of the reasons the people left Sweden was because of the state church and their rules. They had a church warden. The church warden could come and come into your house and check on you. There were no Bible studies that were allowed outside of their church, and this bothered people. They could put you in jail if you had a Bible study in your house that wasn't sanctioned by the church, and this bothered a lot of people. My great-grandfather, Nels, came from Sweden, and they started a church not far from the Salem Lutheran Church in Dalbo, where Ole had started in, that one was 1874. But probably in the early 1800s, they started a church called the Lewis Lake Covenant Church. And in their church charter, they had written in that there would be no outside influence into their church. Nobody could influence what they did in their church. Only their church members decided how they were to worship. Anyway, this was quite a succinct account of early settlers' life, and obviously there were lots of hardships, but they learned to figure things out and cope. And through hard work and perseverance, I think they succeeded in making a good life and from what they left, and I believe that Ole said he had a good life. So, thank you very much. Anybody have any questions?
I do have a question.
Okay.
I just got a little confused. So Carver, so Isanti County is where my mother's people settled?
Yep.
In Stanchville and
Yep. Yeah, that's right in. That's right in the area.
But how far away is Carver County?
Carver County would be west of the cities.
Okay.
It's got to be 60 miles or better, I suppose. Probably at least. It's 45 miles to Anoka from Dalbo.
Okay.
45 from there. It's got to be 60 to 80 miles, I would guess, to Carver County.
So then I'm sorry, I got confused in your story. So some of the people went to Isanti and some of the people went to Carver, or they started in
So-
Carver and kind of branched out?
What happened, when they got there must have been some people that they knew in Carver County. And I believe that's kind of how the immigration thing worked, where, you had a connection somewhere, come here, and then we'll branch out from here. We'll check out and see what it is we've got to do. So I believe that they knew somebody in Carver County, and they went with there. The women and children stayed with those people. And from there, the men heard that up by Alexandria, there would be land to be had. So they went and checked up there. There was no land. They went further up, and there was no land. So they went back to Carver County. And from there, somebody said, check up near Stanchfield in that area up there. So from Carver County then, they went up and checked out up there and then found that there was indeed land.
So that's where they ended up staying, or that's where the homestead is?
Their home, this was all, you know where Dalbo is?
I know where Stanchville is.
Okay, so Dalbo is a little bit west of Stanchfield. Does any, you guys know where Stanchfield is and all those places. It's in the Cambridge area.
About 5 miles west of Cambridge is Dalbo.
Sure, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know exactly where all this stuff.
So the Shinghua family is then providing this. I got confused between Carver County and Isanti County. So these people settled in Isanti County finally.
Yep. That was there in Stanchfield Brook. Stanchfield.
And then Shinghua family was near that place?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, they had to be real close to that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Gary.
Question, do you know what port they came in, Dale, or whereabouts they came in on a ship?
They came to Ellis Island. Through Ellis Island, and then from a train into Ohio at Cleveland, I think it was, and then swapped train to Chicago. Chicago then to La Crosse, and up a ship to St. Paul. So 43 days to get, to their first stop. But,
Great, thank you.
oh, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you for bearing with me.